let's open the floor. So let's open the floor. If any of the participants, people who contributed, people reserved, feel a need or would like to chime in, give their 2 cents, contradict, this is speak now or hold your peace to the next conference. So the floor is happily open.
Willie.
Yeah. Willie.
Like Leora and Ben, I'm struck by the parallels and the situation that Hassan so kind of vividly, and clearly evoked of the position and the dilemmas of specifically the Palestinian community within Israel, and its deep analogies, structural similarities to the dilemmas of Jews in the diaspora before the statehood, before the state of Israel, and I suppose again with humility, I'm struck that there was and there are resources of inventiveness and a certain more self-reflective, self-critical approach to Jewishness in that history and in that moment, and that there's still some distance to go. I think that the impulse and spirit of the ACRI project is out ahead, perhaps, of the language that's still kind of available to talk about what it is we're trying to do. Sort of formulations like, why do the people who would benefit most from human rights resist them, is something that, say, one of the figures I wrote about, an Isaac Auerwitz, who was a Jewish nationalist and a radical and a lawyer, would kind of laughed at a little bit, in the sense that he would understand, as I am confident ACRI understands, that it's not at all clear what would be the benefits from the point of view of the ultra-Orthodox community of the more vigorous enforcement of human rights, and they would not necessarily, as I don't think she's here any longer, but the advocate who works with the Bedouin community points out, if there was a choice on the table whether the language of human rights is what we would choose or some other political language, some other repertoire of resources, that the question wouldn't necessarily be decided in favor of human rights in courts, as opposed to resources for party building, as opposed to sort of things to put on the table to make coalitions, so that it's an improvisation in which one doesn't want to begin with quite so many priors. Given the direness of the situation, given the results of the election, the sort of opening up sort of human rights to a much more radical questioning of how we can sort of not just translate but change our own normative vocabulary along with our interlocutors' vocabulary, rather than sort of knowing that here we stand, there's some things you won't take back from us, that we make something new together. Forgive me for being so vague and preachy, but I do have a sense that it's just the beginning of and that there was in certain forms and moments of Jewish nationalism much more of a sense of we can be both particular and universal. We understand that we're self-invented. We understand that we've always been sort of taking from other groups, putting in ourselves, inventing ourselves, and we're not, that the most radical ones, including the lawyers, were, sort of saying we're ready to dismantle everything about the sort of privileging of Jewish particularism, even as we stay loyal to some rights of the Jews as groups. That what it means to be loyal to Jews can mean, a fierce embrace of universalism in some contexts, and not just sort of bringing the benefits of Jewish universalism as our form of particularity. Forgive me for going on so long, and I say it with, again, just a humility and identification with the project in the sense that it's just beginning, because the situation is pretty dire.
Okay. We'll go down the road. Jim, is that a hand?
Sure.
No, or I imagined it. Any other hands out there? Jim Leffler.
I'm struck, first of all, by what Sam said, because the conference he's talking about, he has written about, was a conference born out of its own moment of crisis, right, where there was a need to create apologetics and to explain to Jews in the early 70s what it meant, what the connection was. And it feels, so that makes me think about this conference, and I'm certainly somebody who wrote in my paper we're at a moment of crisis, but I'm not sure what that crisis is, and I feel like we've all talked too much about the election as a stand-in for larger things, as if the election will now show us the rest of history in front of us. And we don't, we can imagine the worst, it may be the worst, but if we had this conference 3 weeks earlier, we probably wouldn't be talking in that way. We'd be probably trying to articulate more specifically what is the crisis here, or there are multiple crises, right, for Israeli society, human rights, or for human rights. So I'm curious to hear, Ben, Sam, and Laura, maybe all of us, and maybe even Scott, reflect on this. But that leads me to the question about whether the crisis is also about not the creative tension, but the kind of agonizing tension that's here, which is precisely reflected in what we started to comment on, which is that it's two wildly different religions: the religion of history and the religion of law or human rights, right? And in many contexts, what Jewish history can add to this conversation is an acute self-awareness about this dilemma, how history can, often be a huge challenge to traditional faith systems, or a substitute for it, but in some ways is incompatible with it, right? So if I could make this more specific, I might ask Ben, do you also see that tension, and then I would ask Sam, we need that history here, but of course, wouldn't that history simply make it harder to create the positive myths that we want to emerge, to have social solidarity, to have the movements, to have all that? Now, the final thought I have is basically about something that I also feel we haven't talked a lot about, which is just perhaps the crisis in international law today. If it's not just about Jews, not just about rights, but what does international law mean? And certainly this is a local example of what international law doesn't seem to be able to do. But we have other examples with Russia and many other places today where international law seems to be, just like human rights, it seems to be never more prevalent and never more weaker in actually changing things. So I'd be curious to have us think about if this was a conference just about international law and Jews, would anything be different? And is that a bigger crisis? Is that the bigger crisis that we're not talking about because we're focused on King Bibi?
Carol, please,
Okay,
happily.
I can't put all of this into words because I'm tired, but I want to be a historian for a minute and think that we're a quarter of a century since the end of the Cold War. And we're living in this post-liberal era, whatever that is. We have liberalism lying all over the floor. It is, the author of all kinds of horrible things, since it first appeared on the human scale. And I'm trying to come to terms with this, in a sense. There was an Indian philosopher who wrote that liberalism is responsible for American racism, and put all of that together. So I don't quite understand where we are in terms of that, because human rights, after all, comes out of a liberal project, or at least an attempt at. It also, one word we haven't mentioned at all, I don't think, in this conference is the Holocaust.
Yeah. Well, there was a panel on it, but yes.
Well, but I mean,
Okay.
as you know, as part of this story, I mean, Sam said, you know, what is Jewish about all of this?
Yeah, sure.
You know, it's somewhere out there. I guess I'm just mulling, you know, the age that we find ourselves in at the outcome of, you know, at the moment of this conference. You know, presumably, and I got into a big fight in Jerusalem over this, you know, about winning the Cold War. No, we didn't win the Cold War, as most people know. And what has it meant, you know, in the last 25 years? You know, the kind of level of disappointment, disillusion, especially in the 1990s, about the outcome, you know, of what was supposed to be something very definitive. And how does the whole project of human rights, you know, come into this? And I guess this is what's swirling in my head right now.
Sure.
If anyone wants to respond, that's fine.
I think we'll just go down. Marcus, do you want to jump in, or just going down the row?
I think that one of the points that I would like to emphasize is that the perspective of human rights, what it is not clear enough, it was perceived completely different in different sets, especially if we are talking about the West and the East, Eastern Europe, or the Middle East. And I think that it is important to take into account because when we are talking about the civic rights, the minority rights, and the human rights as a kind of converging discourses, the question of the difference, bridging the difference, the taking into account the specific groups in light of a kind of abstract human, which is Western. That means liberal, and I think that it is a point that it was. It appears in several points, but it was not discussed as an issue.
Lena, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm actually troubled by the genealogy that's offered by the structure of the conference, with the only contemporary discussion being Israel. So we move from Jewish rights and historical perspective to Israel, which suggests that Israel somehow represents Jews in a very clean, easy way. And there's no discussion of Jews outside of Israel. So the really interesting things I think that are happening in terms of human rights and Jews right now are in the U.S. with Open Hillel and Jewish Voice for Peace, which doesn't feature into the story because somehow now all Jews are just framed within the unfortunate nation state of Israel.
Well, food for thought for the next program, obviously. Anyone else? Yeah?
Maybe,
Please, Miss.
yeah.
Please.
Unfortunately I missed yesterday, but so I don't have a real context.
We're being recorded, so you can see it anytime.
I know. Well, I was just wondering, you know, the afternoon sessions, two of them, kind of the main the major conflict we were describing was between Ashkenazi and traditionalist Mizrahi Jews, you know, who came from Arab and North African countries. I was just wondering if that was part of the history as well, the Jewish history, because this conflict, at least one way to think about it, is like to really trace the historical roots of these two groups. And I was just wondering if you can comment on that.
On whether it was part of the conference or
No, whether or not you have something to say about kind of the historical roots of because this is not kind of the way. It's like kind of the 0 point was Israel, the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But since we are, since the conference is about history and Jewish history, I was just wondering if that part of Jewish history was kind of part of our kind of historical account.
So, Ben, why don't we take one or two more comments and then we'll let you guys wrap up. Okay. Hassan, do you want to make a comment?
3 years ago, I had interviewed in one of the right-wing newspaper in Israel called Makor Rishon, and they choose the title of my interview that I am saying about the Palestinians in Israel, we are the last Jews in the earth. So it was...
Makor Rishon?
Yeah, Makor Rishon, that I am saying. So one of the reasons that this came is because the characterization of the struggle of the Palestinians in Israel, they choose the civil rights struggle. Now, if we want to know what is the alternative or the contra of civil rights struggle as paradigm, is the armed struggle. Like, if you move, the armed struggle. So they negate the violence, choose. So they negate the violence and they use the civil rights struggle. Why I said we are the last Jews? Not because they choose the civil rights rhetoric as the or the human rights as the main rhetoric for living their daily life, but because the naivety of that to believe that through civil rights talk within this hard situation, our national conflict, you can change your situation. Now, in the Palestinian world, was also the PLO is the contra of the civilians in the Palestinian Israel. They believe just in armed struggle. Armed struggle is the way for freedom. Now, what happened lately that the PLO changed and legalized the Palestinian question and became also Jews. And they perceive today the only way for struggle is to internationalize through human rights mechanism the Palestinian case. And this is why today we see the Palestinian case, Palestinian-Israeli case is the most internationalized case in the world. Mm-hmm. And the arena of the struggle, UN, State Department, EU, all legal mechanism. This is why also we understand why propaganda became a matter. Propaganda became a matter because the arms are not the matter. So the mouth is a matter. And to convince, in your opinion, is a matter. Now, one of the cases that I had about the Nakba law. The Nakba law is Israel new law that say that you are not allowed as Palestinian to commemorate the Nakba, and if you are funded organization, Israel will cut your fund. So we went to the Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the law. The same day afternoon, I was invited here in Tel Aviv University to speak about Hannah Arendt book, Jewish Writing, and to choose We Refugees, the article. Then I said to them, I am Cohen. I am Mr. Cohen of Hannah Arendt in We Refugees, that to go before Israeli, Zionist, Jewish Supreme Court, that by its definition, negating the Nakba, and to argue for the Nakba cause before them. This is like the story of Mr. Cohen when he visited France in Paris. So the dilemmas of using civil rights, I think, of the Palestinian because of all of this. To which extent the naivety is strong and deep by using civil rights when everybody kill each other and armed struggle, it seems, a matter here.
So I guess I'll give the three panelists a few minutes each to wrap up and final words, and if anyone wants to respond or any comments, after thoughts, or not.
I have nothing. I'm pleased for such wonderful, reflections.
I have. I feel like I need to respond to your question since it was put to me. I'm a little confused by it because in my suggestion that the analogies of places like Catholicism in the U.S. civil rights movement that were able to, how should we put this, weave for themselves an idiom that was able to absorb certain human rights norms under a different name, and the suggestion that that might have an analogy here. I honestly wasn't thinking of a way that would have privileged Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi Jews, and that may have been naive on my part, but I was thinking of sources that were in a language that was deep enough that it would have been at least partially.
That was not the point.
I must have misunderstood your
just,
comment.
I'm talking about kind of a fuller kind of historical account that might help us understand, like, kind of the current situation here and kind of historical, to trace the historical roots of both groups.
Yeah.
In order to understand, current, orientations of the.
Trust me when I tell you it would be unbelievably pretentious of me to try to do that.
I think on that note, I think it's a happy conclusion. Thank you very much to all the participants who came from as far as Texas or Hamburg or Pennsylvania or even Boston now? Yes. Boston, I apologize, and Washington. Thank you to conference co-organizers Laura and Dina, and many, many thanks to Eitan in the corner and Donna as well for making things run on time. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. in the same room.